Lecture number 10. We'll be looking at slides 101 through 118. In this lecture, we want to talk about the background of Nehemiah's Persia and also what is covered in chapter 1 of the book of Nehemiah. Slide 102. As a prelude, we need to remember that the coming of Ezra, which is described in the latter chapters of the book of Ezra, was such an important renewal of the covenant for the people of Israel. And this renewal is going to carry on into the book of Nehemiah, but with some different aspects as well as some common threads. Certainly you will see the common threads of the problem of mixed marriages with foreigners, but you will also see that whereas Ezra was primarily concerned with the teaching of the Torah, Nehemiah is going to be concerned with the safety of the city as well. The neighboring peoples, the locals, had been continually in opposition to the work of the Jews in rebuilding the temple. However, because of the appeals that were made to officials in the Persian capitals, the locals were actually compelled to allow the temple's reconstruction. Not only compelled to allow it, but to help support it, to offer supplies for its rebuilding. Nonetheless, they did not suspend their opposition to this project, and they continued in their attempts to harass the Jews, to discourage them, and to make things as difficult as possible. About the time of Ezra's arrival, the Jews had begun to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. You find this mentioned briefly in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 12, where in a letter to Artaxerxes it was mentioned that the Jews were restoring the walls and repairing the foundations of the city. The locals, of course, protested this very vigorously, and they composed a letter to Artaxerxes, a letter that is recorded in Ezra chapter 4, beginning in verse 8 and all the way through nearly the end of the chapter. In this letter, they accused the Jews of being historically rebellious, of having a long history of difficulty and opposition to their emperors. And so in the end, the work on the walls was forced to stop. In fact, Artaxerxes sent a letter back to the Trans-Euphrates region, and it says in verse 23, as soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. And so what you are going to read about in the beginning of the book of Nehemiah is against the background of the suspension of work on the rebuilding of the walls and the gates of Jerusalem. Hanani, who was a Jew traveling from Jerusalem to Persia, he reported to Nehemiah that the walls of Jerusalem were broken down and the gates had been burned with fire. And you'll find this in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 3. Jerusalem, the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, its gates have been burned with fire. Now, this description may not refer merely to what had been done by the Babylonians back in 586 BC, but it may also refer to what local officials in the Trans-Euphrates region had done to enforce Artaxerxes' stop order. When the local officials had received the stop order, in all likelihood, they destroyed whatever efforts had been made to reconstruct the walls and to rebuild the gates. And so this report came to Nehemiah in about 445 BC. You'll notice that in the opening of the book of Nehemiah, it says, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah. Now, this reference to the 20th year is not immediately clear, but if you look at chapter 2 and verse 1, you'll see in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the story picks up. And so we assume that the 20th year in chapter 1, verse 1, is the same as the 20th year in chapter 2 and verse 1, and that would be the 20th regnal year of Artaxerxes I. Slide 103. We do need to mention again and to remind you of the structure of Ezra chapter 4 because it bears directly upon the book of Nehemiah. Back in Ezra chapter 4, you may remember we talked in an earlier lecture about the fact that the first 5 verses of this chapter describe the efforts of the Jews to begin building the temple of God when they returned from Babylon. But that work was vigorously resisted and discouraged. It says that the Trans-Euphrates peoples that surrounded them worked against them. They tried to frustrate their plans, and they did this throughout the entire reign of Cyrus, the king of Persia, and all the way down to the reign of Darius I, the king of Persia. The story of the reconstruction of the temple does not pick up again until all the way down in chapter 4 and verse 24 of Ezra, and then on into chapter 5. So verse 24 says, "Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, the king of Persia." Now between chapter 4 and verse 5 of Ezra and chapter 4 and verse 24 of Ezra, there are 2 other incidents that are described. These, however, occurred considerably later in time than the work on the temple. The first of these is just a very brief mention in chapter 4 and verse 6 of some kind of accusation that was lodged against the Jews during the reign of Xerxes in about 586 BC. We don't know anything more about this. Xerxes is the one that we know from the Bible as the husband of Esther, and so it may have had something to do with what happens in the book of Esther, but that's just a subject that we have to have some historical humility about because we don't know how to place that with any precision. On the other hand, the second opposition against the people in Jerusalem goes all the way up into the period of Artaxerxes I. And in fact, it is the one that does describe the initial efforts to rebuild the walls and to rebuild the gates. And of course, out of this circumstance, the Trans-Euphrates officials composed their letter to Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes responded by issuing a stop order to the Jews so that they could not any longer reconstruct walls or gates. And that becomes then the essential background of the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is concerned with this issue that the city of Jerusalem is extremely vulnerable. Without walls and without gates, it would be wide open to marauders. And so this is a very serious circumstance. By the way, I should mention just briefly a little bit about construction of ancient walled cities. Walls in ancient cities were usually constructed of stone or mud brick. Sometimes quarried stone, sometimes field stone, sometimes mud brick, but something quite substantial. And these were built up often in rather thick walls, sometimes in what are called casemate walls, which are double walls in which the interior is connected by partitions, and then the inside is filled with slag. Gates, on the other hand, are made of wood. Rock gates are not very functional because the weight would be prohibitive for them to be useful. So gates were generally made of wood. And so this is why the description in Nehemiah begins with the idea that the walls of Jerusalem were broken down. This refers to the stone type of walls, but that the gates were burned with fire. And of course, this would refer to wooden gates. Slide 104. It's also probably appropriate before going further to rehearse the history of the time just to fix it firmly in our minds. The Babylonian Empire fell to Cyrus the Persian in 539 BC, on the night that Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall. This, of course, resulted in the decree of Cyrus that displaced peoples could go back and rebuild their ancient sanctuaries. And, of course, that affected the Jews as well. So by 538, the first wave of Jewish repatriates were headed back toward Jerusalem to begin rebuilding their ancient capital city. They arrived in Jerusalem, and by 536, they were ready to begin building the great altar and lay the foundation of the second temple. This, of course, resulted in much opposition from the locals until the work came to a standstill, and it remained at a standstill throughout the remainder of the reign of Cyrus, through the short reign of Cambyses, and into the second year of the reign of Darius I. The second year of the reign of Darius I would have been 520 BC, and this is when the work on the temple began again, largely under the impetus of the two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, who preached so urgently that the people must not neglect this work. And so with the help of these two prophets, the leaders Zerubbabel and Joshua began the work again, and finally the temple was completed in 516 BC, during the reign of Darius I. Then you've got about a 50-year hiatus in which we don't know much of what happened. We do have this one reference in Ezra 4 to an accusation made against the Jews during the reign of Xerxes. And of course we have the book of Esther, which describes an entire movement against the Jews empire-wide during the reign of Xerxes. But we really don't have any more details until we get to the return of Ezra in 458 BC. And this would have been during the reign of Artaxerxes I. Ezra received permission to return, and so he comes back as a teaching priest to reaffirm the covenant and to teach the law of Moses to the people. During this time, there was an effort to begin rebuilding the walls and the gates, as we have just mentioned a few moments ago. And yet that received a response of a stop order from Artaxerxes I, and so that work had to be suspended. And in fact, it would appear that the locals not only made them suspend their work, but actually took action to break down whatever work they had done and to burn the gates that they had started rebuilding with fire. So this is the situation for the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is going to make his return in 445 BC, which is the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes. The other kings in the Persian Empire I've listed here also on slide 104 includes Darius II, Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, and Darius III. And by the time you get to the end of Darius III, you are at the end of the Persian Empire. Darius III would later then face the fierce army of Alexander the Great. And in 333 BC, Alexander's armies met the soldiers of Darius III, about 500,000 soldiers actually, at the Battle of Issus, where the Persian army was crushed. Then Alexander marched back toward Palestine and Egypt, and after he had subdued those areas, he came back again into Mesopotamia, and once again met Darius and the Persian cavalry on the plain of Tigris, and once again, the Greeks were victorious. And so by 330 BC, the Persian Empire comes to an end and is absorbed into Alexander's empire of the Greeks. So that takes you quite a bit further than the book of Nehemiah, but at least you have some sense of where history was going at this point. Slide 105. Perhaps a little bit is in order about Nehemiah the man. Nehemiah, unlike Ezra, does not seem to have been a priest. But when he heard the report from Hanani that the walls of Jerusalem were broken down and in disrepair and that the gates had been burned with fire, he was very distressed because he knew instinctively that this kind of vulnerability for the city of Jerusalem was not a good thing. So he began a prayer of confession in the midst of his distress and a plea for God's help. O Lord God of heaven, he prayed, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We've acted very wickedly toward you. We've not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Now, Nehemiah's prayer, in some measure, is very much like Ezra's prayer, because it is a confession in which he identifies himself with the sins of his own nation. This is important because this is really what is described at the end of the book of the curses in Deuteronomy, that if the people of Israel were scattered to the nations as a divine discipline, that if they would turn their hearts toward God and they would confess their sins, that God would hear them. And so both Ezra and Nehemiah participate in this kind of confession. And so Nehemiah prays, "Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name.'" And of course, this is from the book of Deuteronomy. So Nehemiah prays, "They're your servants, your people, whom you've redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Adonai, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." Now the statement, "this man," near the end of verse 11 of Nehemiah 1, is referring directly to Artaxerxes I. You'll remember, of course, it is this same Artaxerxes who has issued the stop order for the walls of Jerusalem, and so it's no small issue for him to confront his own king with the idea that he would reverse his order. Nehemiah's occupation, as is mentioned at the very end of chapter 1, is a cupbearer to the king. This usually is an officer of very high rank, because the cupbearer to the king would have had a very close relationship with the king. He would be with him daily, and his duties would have consisted of tasting any food or wine that would be given to the king, and especially in the context of the possibility of poisoning, which is one of the ancient methods by which monarchs sometimes were assassinated. When we think of assassinations, we often think of a military coup or of some kind of brutal weapon, but poison was certainly an effective means as well. And so by having a cupbearer who tasted all of the king's food and all of the king's drink before he himself would eat of it, if the cupbearer survived and no problems were forthcoming, then it was safe for the king himself to eat. So Nehemiah was this kind of person. In time, he had opportunity to express his concerns to his master, which is going to take us into chapter 2, which we will talk about in the next lecture. Slide 106. Before we leave this lecture, we want to spend just a little bit of time with the Persian background of Nehemiah and a little bit with archaeology. In this slide, you see two very elaborate drinking cups called rhytons from the Persian period, and they date from about the time we're talking about the 5th or the 4th centuries BC. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian, the Persians never finalized any state agreements or treaties or the issue of state documents without some kind of a symbolic drinking from cups very much like these. The one on the left, which is silver, is in the British Museum. If you happen to be in London and you get to go to the British Museum, you'll find it on the 2nd floor of the British Museum in an area that has other Persian artifacts. And the one on the right, which is gold, is in the Tehran National Museum in Iran. These were obviously wonderful art pieces, as well as functional in that they, of course, were actually used in the drinking ceremonies of the Persian officials. Slide 107. A number of cities in ancient Persia are very important, but probably of those that were most important, we should consider Persepolis and Susa. And these are cities that figure directly into the biblical accounts. Darius, Xerxes I, and Artaxerxes I, all of them worked to build state buildings in these two cities, Persepolis and Susa, and they worked on them for over half a century. Work that was begun under Darius I, some of it was not even completed until in the reign of Artaxerxes I, which would have been many years later. Nehemiah, of course, begins in the city of Susa, as is mentioned in the very first verse of the book. He was in the citadel of Susa when he first heard the report that Jerusalem's walls were broken down and the gates had been burned with fire. Slide 108. This slide shows the excavations of the capital of Persepolis, and this, of course, is an aerial view, as is obvious. You can get some sense of perspective about the size of this large state set of buildings by looking at the road to the right, the lower right of the picture. And there you will see very small people that are in the roadway and surrounding the outside of the structure. So that will give you some sense of perspective. You can see the Hall of Columns that is in the right center of the excavations, and then, of course, quite a number of other excavations, such an elaborate administrative capital for the Persian Empire. Slide 109. This is called the Gate of All Nations, which is the entryway into the state quarters of Persepolis. And you will see in the gate the iconic figures which are composites of the body of a bull, the head of a human, which is crowned, of course, for royalty, and the figure on the farthest right. If you look carefully on the interior of the wall, you will see it also has the wings of an eagle. And so, like the creatures that are described in the book of Daniel, these composite creatures were perceived to be guardian figures for the entryway to the state buildings at Persepolis. Slide 110. This photo is of the excavated foundations of Susa, which were constructed by Darius I. Now, Susa, of course, is the place where Nehemiah was serving Artaxerxes, and this would have been sometime later than Darius I, but it would have been a continuation of the construction efforts that Darius had begun. Slide 111. These are the foundations of the King's Hall in Susa. These were completed by Artaxerxes I, and of course, since this was the Artaxerxes whom Nehemiah served, these are the foundations of the very buildings in which Nehemiah lived and worked as the cupbearer to the king. Slide 112. This is a beautiful example of Persian art, a bas-relief on a wall of a composite creature. Just as you will find in Assyrian and Babylonian art, the Persians employed the same kind of composite figures to symbolize guardianship. In this particular one, you will see that this figure has the body of a lion, which is more or less apparent from the style of tail on the animal, and the front two legs, the forelegs, are also lion's legs with lion's paws. However, if you look carefully at the rear legs, you will see that while the leg portions themselves might be similar to a lion, the actual bottom of the legs and the feet are eagle's claws and not lion's paws. Then, if you look at the middle of the body, of course, you see the very apparent wing structure of this creature, the wings of eagles symbolizing speed. And then you have a rather unusual neck, which is a little more hard to identify, but especially it's easy to see that the head is the head of a ram with some kind of mask on it. The fact that it is a two-horned ram reminds you specifically of Daniel chapter 8, where Persia is symbolized as a ram with two horns. This beautiful piece is in some kind of glazed brick. You can get some sense of the brilliant colors that once attended this piece of art in the Persian Empire. And this also, of course, is from the administrative center at Susa, where Nehemiah served. Slide 113. These are glazed brick bas-reliefs of Persian soldiers who are both lancers, you can see their lances in their hands, as well as archers. You can see the quivers on the back of each of the soldiers and the recurve of the bows that they have over their arm. This excavated piece is no longer in Susa. It has been removed and is now in the museum at the Louvre in Paris, France. Slide 114. Also from the Louvre in Paris, France, is a wonderful detail of one of the lancers, this one facing a different direction, but you can see the detail of the spear much more closely, the type of head the spear had. You can also see the elaborately decorated quiver for arrows, and you can also see part of the recurve of the bow that is on the left shoulder of this Persian soldier. Slide 115. This is a bas-relief in the British Museum in London of a satrap, one of the provincial officials of Persia, who's receiving visitors to his administrative center. Now, the word satrap is only found once in the book of Ezra, but you'll find it several times in the book of Esther and the book of Daniel. Satraps were provincial officials, and in this particular case, he's receiving some kind of visitor. We don't know too much other than that. And you'll see he has over his head a type of umbrella to protect him from the Middle Eastern sun. Slide 116. This is a bas-relief of Artaxerxes I, the king during the days of Nehemiah. Now, in this particular bas-relief, you will notice that it conforms to the stereotypical depiction of Persian monarchs. In this case, the head of Artaxerxes has been defaced, probably intentionally by someone who came later. But you still can see quite clearly that it is the stereotypical posture of him sitting on an elaborate seat or throne, his feet on a footstool, the royal staff in his hand, and probably a cup in his left hand. And then he would be approached by courtiers who would come to him with their hands over their mouth to denote their deference to the sovereignty of the emperor. Slide 117. These are the tombs of Darius II, Artaxerxes I, and Darius I. These tombs are only about 3 miles from the excavations at Persepolis, and you can see, of course, by the figures that are standing at the ground level that these are huge tombs, and they have been carved out of the face of these very imposing solid rock walls. The middle one we're going to pay a little more attention to here in just a moment, because this is of Nehemiah's Artaxerxes I. Slide 118. This is then the close-up of the tomb of Artaxerxes I, the place where Nehemiah's king was buried, about 3 miles north of Persepolis. Again, looking at the figures on the ground floor or the level below the cliff, you can get some sense of the size of these very unique, very impressive tombs. So this gives you just a slight perspective about the culture and the time of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, we would assume, was born in Persia during the exile. His parents would have come from Judah and Jerusalem, but Nehemiah himself had probably not seen Jerusalem until the day that he visited it, when he went there, as we find in the book of Nehemiah. But he is very well versed in the covenant of his people. He certainly is very much aware that his people have sinned against Yahweh, and that their only hope was the hope of repentance. And so with that in his heart, he will be sent by Artaxerxes I back to Jerusalem to help rebuild the city walls and its gates. This is the end of Lecture 10.